Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the 18th century economy in Europe. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off discussing these, the ideas of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and even how we try to apply these ideas to rule and governments. And of course, we saw the idea of enlightened despotism. But today we want to shift gears a little and talk about the economy itself and how we take the scientific revolution, even a little bit of those Enlightenment ideals, and begin to apply it not to politics, but to actual everyday life in the economy for average people. And again, a little bit of this, the first section will be a little bit of review from the Scientific Revolution lecture. But again, it's needed to provide that context to understand how much things have changed. You guys ready? Let's go. So, traditional agriculture prior to 1700. Again, realize while we've talked about a lot of changes thus far in European history, since the Renaissance, you'll notice a common theme is other than the ending of serfdom in a lot of areas, peasants and everyday artisans, those who make small goods like horseshoes or, swords or those kind of craftsmen, they had pretty much the same standard of living in the 1700s, early 1700s, as they did in the medieval period, in the Middle Ages. The vast majority of the population, they battled hunger on a daily basis. They lacked sufficient clothing. They lived in substandard housing. 80% of Western European population were farmers. In Eastern Europe, it was closer to 90%. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of European population were farmers. But yet all we've talked about thus far is pretty much that top 10 to 15%, with a few small references here and there. And it's one of my biggest critiques of European history is that it is very much an egocentric, ethnocentric, Western-centric, but it focuses so much on the top-down elites. And such is, unfortunately, the case with Western Civ courses. But let's try to rectify a little bit of that today and talk about, first of all, agriculture, but later on some proto-industry. And so we'll start with the open field system, which is what you see here in the picture. Now, remember, we talked about this a little bit a couple lectures ago, but it's worth repeating a little bit. So we had what was called the open field system. In other words, there were some first of all, there were no fences, no enclosed fields. It was open. And common lands were open with strips of land for agriculture that were not divided by either hedges or fences. The reason is that open fields were farmed as communities. This was very much communal living. Even though, if you think about the comparison to U.S. history, isn't that what we criticize Native Americans for? And realize this is exactly why. It is in this late 1600s, early 1700s, where we really begin to push for what we'll call the closed field system. And so the problem with this open field system, though, was that exhaustion of soil was a common problem. Eventually, 1/3 to 1/2 of all lands were forced to be allowed to lie fallow in any given year so the soil can recover, meaning you're only farming on 2/3 to 1/2 of your actual land due to you need to let it lie, fallow and unused so it can replenish its nutrients. And of course, one of the big difference is the agricultural revolution that arises from the scientific revolution is going to redefine the way we look at farming in our history. It is going science technology, we're going to apply it now to agriculture. And so you take science, you take technology, and you take that kind of idea of private business, entrepreneurship, and apply it to agriculture, we're going to see a revolution known as the agricultural revolution. And quite honestly, it is actually the Low Countries. It's not your typical places. In fact, it actually starts in places like Netherlands and with Dutch. The Dutch are the ones who really begin to pioneer this idea of crop rotation. And they do so by, first of all, enclosing fields. They rotate crops and then use a wide variety of crops. So again, this is the old rotation on your screen. And then they begin to use manure as a heavy use of manure for fertilizer. So let me repeat these real quick. So you enclose your fields, you rotate your crops, including a greater variety of crops, and then you use a heavy use of manure. And the result is a 4-crop rotation versus the standard 3-field system. Now, one of the other features of, in this case, Holland for the Dutch, was that most of the land that they reside in had once been marshland or covered by ocean water, and the water had receded over time. And the Dutch became pioneers and world leaders in reclaiming wetlands through drainage. And so drainage would also, of course, spread to other areas, but it would be incredibly important as a way to reclaim farmlands. Not only are they pioneers, the Dutch, in this 4-field crop rotation using these new crops like clover and turnips and other use potatoes to replenish the soil for nutrients and nitrates, they also are pioneers in reclaiming land to grow more, have more cropland to actually grow food. And so they begin to employ this very big system. And the place that it really, it develops in the Dutch, with the Dutch, in Holland and the Netherlands, but it really takes off in England. In England by 1870, so again, we're jumping a little bit of time here, but by 1870, crop yields had tripled since 1700. So in England, employing this idea of crop rotation and reclaiming land, between 1700 and 1870, crop yields had tripled. Tripled. So you might think, well, I asked this question a lot to you in the past. Well, what do you need for farming? Well, you need laborers. Yeah, they tripled their output or their yield by increasing only 14% of an increase in people. So you increase the workers by 14%, and you were able to draw out 3 times as much of a yield. So how do you do this, right? It's not just the crop rotation, not just reclaiming land. It's not just the increase in workers. Well, it really is about using science, technology, and scientific experimentation. And leading the way in England was Charles Townshend. Charles Townshend and Jethro Tull, as you see here. And so we start seeing this ability to not only pioneer crop rotation. So Charles Townshend, we talk with him first before we get to Jethro Tull. Charles Townshend, he will pioneer crop rotation in England. He was an English ambassador to the Netherlands. And he was witnessing firsthand how the Dutch used turnips, nitrogen-rich turnips and clover, to replenish the soil rather than lying fallow. So Townshend later drains much of the land back home in England and employs crop rotation using turnips, peas, beans, clover, and potatoes. So this enriched soil provided more food for the livestock, which was in turn allowed more manure to be produced by the livestock, which was used as fertilizer. So not only are they replenishing the soil, they're producing more food for animals, which allows them to produce more manure, which gives you more fertilizer, which allows you to plant and grow more crops. Wow. So one thing. This increase in livestock, though, had a secondary benefit besides just, poop. The increased food for livestock meant mass slaughtering of animals was no longer needed prior to winter. See, the old way, many animals would end up dying over winter because they lack the food to sustain over the cold months when things are not growing. And because they're able to eat better and store up that winter fat, they will actually live through the winter now. There's more crops being produced. They have more crops and food that's being stored. And thus, animals can live longer, which means people have a more variety of food. And they're able to eat meat rather than just preserving, surplus meat through salting. So a greater variety of diet, more protein for humans. And of course, we get to then Jethro Tull. Because, hey, you need to be able to plant more efficiently, right? We see only 14% increase in population as far as workers. And Jethro Tull provides the great example of using empiricism of the scientific revolution to apply it to agriculture. He invents a seed drill, as you see pictured on your bottom left. Now, the seed drill allowed for sowing of crops in a straight row rather than scattering by hand. So in the old days, you would just kind of take your hand in the bag, you pick it up, and just go and just scatter seeds. It's very inefficient. Some of the seeds won't take. You're actually wasting seed. And you create a very haphazard growing pattern where it may be more difficult to see the weed from the plant. Well, the seed drill allows you to plant a seed in a straight line. It actually has a little drill in the very bottom that goes down in the soil, creates a little hole, and you drop the seed in. And it creates nice straight rows. It makes it much easier for harvesting, much easier for tending and maintaining it. And it creates a much more uniform and, again, scientific approach to farming. And likewise, they started using selective breeding as a way to produce better animals. And this was pioneered by Robert Bakewell. Now, Robert Bakewell, he will pioneer in the selective breeding of agriculture. And again, the old way was just to let them, do it the old-fashioned way. But through the use of selective breeding, again, a scientific revolution idea, they took the larger and healthier animals and they began to only force those ones to reproduce. This is still something we do in the modern day, that you take the best of the best, you only force them to reproduce, and then you only produce then larger and healthier animals, which will result in increased availability of meat, wool, leather, soap, and even candles. And again, more manure as a result as well. Now, of course, there is a downside, of course, because once you start inbreeding and do selective breeding, you can actually pass on genetic traits that could be either positive, which is what you want, or it can be negative. In this case, the Belgian Blue has a genetic defect as a result of selective breeding. Again, there is a downside. Again, when this gets really taken to the extreme, of course, is in the 19teens, 1920s with the ideas of eugenics and applying this to humans. But nonetheless, applying the scientific revolution was all well and good. And again, through selective breeding, through the 4-crop rotation, and through new technology like the seed drill, we were able to see tremendous advances. However, there's one component we have not discussed yet, and something you all know very, very well, because we've discussed it now for the last 3 years. And that is, well, how do you get these new crops? Remember, potatoes, tomatoes, these were not crops that were, or even beans for that matter, squash. These were not crops that were available to put in the soil to replenish the nitrates in the soil until the Columbian Exchange. And so while yes, wheat and rye and barley were in fact what they used to eat in Europe, and yes, they were exhausting the soil, but the reality was you didn't have much of a choice to do crop rotation, a 4-crop system, compared to the old 3-field system, because you didn't have these nitrogen-rich plants. Things like potatoes, things like beans, things like squash that will replenish the soil. And so it's only after the Columbian Exchange is initiated, excuse me, that we are finally able to bring those products to Europe and begin to experiment. Again, remember, it takes time for them to come back. People get used to them and begin learning, experiment how to plant them. So it takes 100 years plus. So again, you're not talking until around the mid 1600s when you finally get this thing fully implemented throughout Europe. So again, I'm not going to belabor the point, but understand the Columbian Exchange, and remember, this is all tied together. These are not, just, indiscriminate or separate parts. These are all connected and interwoven into one large tapestry. Now, of course, what happens next is landowners seek to increase profit from this production. And this is the picture you see is the common pasture. So we're going to shift from agriculture to horticulture. I'm sorry, not horticulture. Sorry. We're going to shift from agriculture to animals, right? And we're going to talk about the enclosure movement. Because this is a very big deal. Because I remember it has science, technology, and entrepreneurship is all features of the agricultural revolution. And that entrepreneurship begins to be applied to both agriculture, yes, but also animal production, livestock raising. And initially, it really begins in the 16th century in England, as landowners begin to seek to increase profits from wool production, from sheep, by enclosing their fields. So the thought was, well, if you have open fields, the sheep can leave, other people are using it, you're not able to produce the best, the fullest, the largest, sheep, and thus the wool from the sheep. And so the difference with the enclosure movement is that it does not start out primarily as agriculture, which we will talk, that's what develops later as a result of the agricultural revolution. But the enclosure movement is going to cut off poorer peasants and lead to, on the one hand, higher profits, yes, but also the wealthy getting wealthier. Again, this is all a process. And so we start out in the 16th century with the enclosure movement just for animals. But by the 18th century, we are seeing it being applied to agriculture. And so while, yes, people are having more food, animals are growing larger, producing more manure, we are doing crop rotation, life is good, but in doing so, we will start creating what's called the enclosure movement of agriculture. And so they take common pasture lands for the animals, and they enclose those and basically push out the peasant. And what the result of this is agriculture no longer becomes a peasant, everyday, everyone activity, but rather it becomes a large commercial venture, or as I often called in U.S. history, agribusiness. Large landowners prosper and they invest in technology, things like machinery, breeding, cultivation methods, as a way so they can make more money. And the result is Parliament then, which remember is run by the nobles, is going to pass more than 3,000 enclosure acts that will be to the great benefit of large landowners. And so, to the detriment, even though the peasants are eating better now, in theory, and able to live longer and not have to worry so much about starvation, they are going to be put down in a lower class with no hope of escape due to these enclosure acts. One of the most famous of which is called the Corn Laws of 1815. This place is not only does it entrench the enclosure movement, but it benefits landowners because it places high tariff on foreign grain. And something we talked about before with tariffs, that okay, we put a high tariff on foreign products, that's great, protects domestic issues and domestic producers. But often what happens is it also increases prices. And so the poor in England did not see benefit from the tariff. In fact, they saw nothing but detriment because as the local prices of grain went up as a result, they are forced to pay more money for the food. And again, this is just an example of laws being passed to benefit only the wealthy at the expense of the peasantry. In addition to higher prices on food and grain, The enclosure would also force many peasants off the land that had once been common. They were forced to move into cities or towns. They were forced to move into urban centers to look for work that was because less work was available in the countryside. Many were forced into poorhouses or horrific conditions in factories. Many became tied as impoverished farm laborers. Now, there would be some possible benefit to this, is it did force people to look for new work. And some people will take this opportunity and through some luck, through some initiative, and they will begin dabbling in the proto-industrial we'll talk about in a minute. So there will be some people that will see benefit from this as peasants. But for the most part, this has done nothing but hurt peasantry because it only benefits those at the top who are already at the top. Now, there has been a big debate in history over the impact of the enclosure movement. The traditional view of it said enclosures pushed thousands of peasants out of the countryside into abject poverty. So it pushes thousands of peasants into the cities, fleeing the countrysides, while those who remain will live in abject poverty. And again, this is a theory that socialist Karl Marx puts forth. However, more recent research has put forth the idea that maybe the enclosure movement downsides have been greatly exaggerated, because many thousands in the countryside would begin working as small landowners. So again, because so many thousands left the countryside, it did leave an opportunity for small farmers to have a chance. In addition, the reality was we're pointing to the late 18th century here, early 19th century as far as these enclosure movements. But the reality is more than half of England's farmland had already been enclosed prior to 1750. And so maybe it's too harsh to say that things like corn laws, which yes, they only benefit the rich, but maybe, just maybe, that it's a little bit egregious to state that this was the downfall of the peasantry, when in reality it had been a trend long coming. Again, starting in the 1600s with the enclosure of grazing land. It just had a big boost in the early 19th century. But nonetheless, one thing that will greatly happen is a population explosion. Remember, prior to 1700, famine, disease, and warfare limited population growth. It was not until the mid-16th century that we finally reached those pre-Black Death levels from the early 1300s. So it took almost 250 years. It took almost 250 years to recapture the population that existed prior to the Black Death. But what changes here is the advent of new food. The agricultural revolution makes more food available. We have new food like potatoes. And we have a better diet as a result of greater food varieties and increased meat intake. Now, but don't forget, these are not the only things. We also start seeing better sanitation. Some of those industrial revolution techniques will be applied to cities, and we'll have better sewage systems in cities. Again, I'm saying this some better. Don't misquote me. This is not like we have leaps and bounds. We have a modern sanitation system. But it is a marked improvement, and fewer people are dying at a younger age. So while it took 250 years to recover that pre-Black Plague levels, after 1750, from 1700 to 1800, we will see a population explosion that will increase from about 120 million all the way up to 190 million people in just fewer than 100 years. This is a tremendous change. You see on the chart there. And we start getting to the 1900s, it'll explode even more with new technology and increased science technology being applied to all parts of society. One of which was the beginning of industrialization. Now remember, this is not the Industrial Revolution yet. That's not for a while. But you remember how I said that some peasants were able to use their freedom from the enclosure movement as a way to engage in other things? Again, a few, not full, but a few. Oh yeah, so one of the reasons they are able to explode in the 18th century population. But what we see here is a few people are able to engage in something new. It is what we call proto-industrialization, known as the cottage industry. And again, this is a step one toward industrialization. And so while some people are forced off the land, and they will remain in the countryside, even despite being forced off their land, they can't afford to go to the cities, they don't want to go to the cities. Rural industry became a major pillar of Europe's economic growth during the 18th century. And basically it's out of need. It's a needs-based, development. Rural population was eager to supplement their incomes. Again, they're losing money from farming thanks to the enclosure movement, so they find other ways to make up that money. And what happened was merchant capitalists in cities were eager to use the cheap labor of the countryside rather than paying higher rates to guild members in the city. So again, remember there's guilds for these artisans and craftsmen in the city who make these products. And because they're guild members, they get paid higher rates. So you outsource, right? This is how you break unions. You outsource and find cheap labor elsewhere. In this case, they're not going out of the country, but they're going to the hinterlands, to the countrysides. They go to the countrysides and find these cheap peasant laborers who are willing to work more cheaply but still produce goods. And so this is what was called the putting out system, because they're putting industrial production in the countrysides. And so in these countryside areas, manufacturing with hand tools and peasant cottages became this big challenge to the urban craft industry. And what's developed here is known as the cottage industry. And so these merchant capitalists would provide raw materials like wool, and they would give it to a rural family who would take that raw wool and produce either finished or semi-finished products to be sent back to the merchant for payment. And again, you're normally paid not by the hour or even the days, you're paid by the number of pieces you produce. And the merchants, of course, will turn and sell the finished product for a profit. And again, the number one product here is wool. And the cottage industry became a family enterprise. It was common for 4 or 5 spinners needed to keep one weaver steadily employed. And husband and wife are constantly trying to find more thread and more spinners. In fact, the term became spinsters. I'm sure you've heard that term in your life. And usually we think of it nowadays as kind of the old woman who lives by herself, or not old, but middle-aged woman who lives by herself in an apartment, has 15 cats. She's known as a spinster. Well, spinsters get their name derived from this cottage industry. They were widows and unmarried women who spun for a living, hence the term spinster. Again, if it's the term widow or unmarried woman. Now, sometimes several families might subcontract to work for each other as a way to provide more revenue and more workers, more spinners. There were some problems with this. There were constant disputes between the cottagers and the merchants over the weight of material and quality of cloth. Remember, you don't have a quality control here. You're at the mercy of what these cottage industrial people are trying to do. In the constant search for more efficient methods of production, it will result in what will eventually see the growth of factories in the Industrial Revolution. So there is some long-term legacy of this as well, but for a time, the cottage industry will flourish, especially in England. Now, what are the results of this? Well, let me go back here. Thousands, of poor rural families will be able to supplement their incomes. The unregulated production in the countryside will result in the experimentation and the diversification of goods. In other words, this is both good and bad. So on the one hand, it might produce poor quality goods. That's bad because people are not taking it seriously. They're trying to skirt, they're trying to skimp and scrape to try to get more money out of the number of wool they have, or produce inferior products to increase their profit. Yes, that happens. But it also breeds innovation. People are looking for new, better ways to do things. And through this necessity-based innovation, we will start seeing the beginnings of some experimentation that will lead to really positive steps in new techniques and even new technologies. So this cottage industry is going to flourish first in England. Again, in the early 1500s, half of England's textiles were being produced in the countryside. By 1700, that percentage was even higher. The putting out system, again, the cottage industry, would spread from England later into continental countries like France and Germany. And again, it will ultimately lead, so again, they will become the inventor. And again, I say agricultural invention, but note also for proto-industry, because these farmers are being inventors, even for this textile industry. And we'll start seeing a number of new products being developed largely in the countryside. Move my little picture here so you can see the spinning mule over here. There we go. And we start seeing in 1733, John Kay invents the flying shuttle. You see on your top left. And of course, you see my picture in the bottom left. This is the flying shuttle, as you see if you ever saw the movie Wanted. He's trying to catch it. The flying shuttle enables weavers to throw the shuttle back and forth between the threads with one hand, thus being able to keep on pedaling the entire time. In 1764, James Hargreaves invents the spinning jenny, which rapidly improves thread spinning. And then in the 1780s, we see the invention of the steam engine to produce power looms. And many historians point to the 1780s and the invention of the steam engine to power looms. This is, most historians consider the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 1780s, because it is with the use of steam engine, we go from using manpower to steam. And once we do that, we open a whole new realm of possibilities for inventions and techniques. And then finally, in Samuel Crompton in 1799, will invent the spinning mule, bottom right, which combines the best features of the water frame and the spinning jenny. And when you add steam power to it, we will start seeing the advent of the Industrial Revolution. But again, this is all being done as a way to, initially, for the cottage industry. Now, there are much more to talk about as far as the 18th century economy and what everyday life is like in the 18th century. But we'll talk about that in our next lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.